Okay, thank you, Ashok. I want to talk this morning about the use of fiscal instruments in the control of diets, essentially to create incentives which work by creating the incentives to eat well and the disincentives to eat badly. The use of these instruments is becoming increasingly of interest to policymakers and is of great interest in the academic literature. For example, one recent study in the UK shows that the use of such instruments have the potential to save between 900 and 1,000 premature deaths per year. The effectiveness of these measures is a very good example of an epidemiological principle which argues that when we don't have precise means of screening and targeting our measures at the particular diseases that we're interested in other words, we have sick populations, that the measures that are best used to control these policies, these issues, are population-based measures. Purpose of my paper is not to argue against this principle, nor to argue that taxes and fiscal instruments are not useful in this process. What I want to do is to just deepen the economic analysis of these instruments a little bit. And if you push me, what I'm going to argue really is that these instruments are not really levers. They're more like a gentle breeze that sort of blows people's behaviour in a particular direction. And as such, they might be rather imprecise in achieving the kinds of economic outcomes that we're interested in. When we look at these things from an economic perspective, what we tend to focus on, what we ought to focus on, are the distributional impacts of these measures. In other words, we want to know whose lives we're saving. Who are these 900,000 people's lives that we're saving with these instruments? And who is it that pays the price of the tax? Who bears the burden of the tax? The policies that we're talking about, these fiscal policies, work by affecting a marginal change in the distribution of food consumption. And their effectiveness in saving lives rests on the presumption that a large number of people's diets will be changed, and therefore a small number of lives can be changed, even if we're only able to effect marginal changes with those diets. What I want to argue is that from a social perspective, what we're interested in is not making small changes in the mean levels of consumption in the population, but what we're actually interested in are those people that have particularly bad diets, and what we want to achieve with those people are not small marginal changes in their diets. What we want to effect with those people are large and substantial changes in their diets. So the first piece of work that I want to talk about looks at the implementation of a fiscal policy. And what we do is we construct a measure which weights people's diets according to how far they are away from the recommended intakes of the nutrients that we want to control. Our measure estimates the relative risk of suffering for the disease, the average level of relative risk of suffering from a disease in a population. What it does, in common with the epidemiological literature, is it uses a logistic function to add an increasing weight, to weight increasingly the diets that are a long distance away from the mean. The policy that we simulate taxes saturated fats at the rate of 1 percentage point for every percentage point of saturated fat that there is in the food, and we also add a subsidy on fruit and vegetables in order to encourage the consumption of those goods. The figures that you see on this slide, they're a little small, you probably can't see them too clearly at the back, I'm afraid. The two columns of numbers on the right there show the relative risk, the average level of relative risk in the population relative to a situation where the whole population consumed according to the dietary recommendations. The figures on the left are the before tax figures and the figures on the right are the after tax figures. And what these figures show is that the change in the number is very, very small as a result of this imposition of this tax. And the reason for that is precisely what I talked about at the outset, which is that we're not changing people's diets by very much, and there are still a very significant number of people whose diets are some considerable distance away from the mean level of consumption. Sorry, let me just go back from that slide. Okay, the second issue that I want to address is who pays the taxes. It's well known, it's an accepted economic fact, and probably wider than economics, that the proportion of people's expenditure on food decreases as their incomes increase. And therefore, it's a fact that such a policy, a tax policy on food, will be a regressive tax. If we're combining the tax with a subsidy, some politicians may claim that we're addressing that particular issue, that by using a subsidy to counter the effects of the tax, we make inroads into the regressivity of the tax. What matters, though, is the relative distribution of the taxed good and the subsidised good within the population, if that fact is to be true. So these figures show a measure which is known as the distributional characteristic of goods in an economy. The distributional characteristic measures the degree to which goods are concentrated in the socially deserving, those people who we would wish to apply a subsidy to and not to tax. The higher the number, the higher the concentration in the socially deserving. And what we see on the left there is that the very goods that we want to tax, milk, breads, eggs, the high-fat goods, are at the top of the distributional characteristic. Some way down, we see fruit and vegetables. So what we're doing with this policy, this tax subsidy policy, is that we're taxing the people that we don't want to tax, and we're subsidising the people that we don't want to subsidise. So the consequence of that policy, the combination of the subsidy and the tax, is that we actually make the tax more aggressive than we would if we just applied a simple tax. If we look at the right-hand column, what we've done there is to disaggregate the goods a little bit more, to actually look at goods which are likely to be taxed and subsidised rather than the aggregates which are on the left. And what we see there is that the position is actually even worse, because if we look at the top of that table, the highest distributional characteristic is for UHT whole milk, a good which we don't want to tax because it has a high concentration in the socially deserving, but the very good that we will tax because it has a high level of fat composition. Some way down, towards the bottom, are the semi-skimmed, the fully skimmed, and the milk that has the fat extracted from it, the goods that will have the low tax rates. So again, we see the distribution of the goods in the population amplifying the regressivity that we would observe if we just argued on the basis that the fact that food consumption is a decreasing proportion of households' expenditure in households. What we see, therefore, is what we might call a double whammy, in the words of a famous Conservative politician describing fiscal policy in the UK some time ago. What we see is a situation where we're actually not achieving the health gains in the population that we want to achieve. The health gains are being achieved with those people that don't have the particularly bad diets. And furthermore, those bad diets will tend to be consumed by poorer households. And the fiscal policy, the distributional impacts of this fiscal policy are taxing those households and redistributing the income to the richer households. I've been referring primarily to the global north, to a developed country study. This is all UK-based information. I want to just make a few remarks in the context of this conference on what might the implications of such a policy be in the global south. These conditions that we observe, these health conditions that we observe in the north, are only just beginning to appear in the global south. But as we heard this morning, the nutrition transition is one of those facts of life that will come to all countries in time. So as the nutritional transition begins to take place, the nutritional transition means that we see growing incomes and diets of the urban populations moving towards those sorts of diets that lead to the adverse health implications that we're trying to tax. The rural poor probably stay with the conventional traditional diets of the country in question, but those rural poor will also bear a burden of the tax because they are the producers of the food which we're taxing as a consequence of this policy. So in this context, the double whammy becomes a triple whammy. And then finally, I want to just refer to some likely unintended consequences of the sort of policy that we're talking about. First of all foods have some nutritional good. Even high-fat milk, even high-fat meat diets have some nutritional quality. If we put a tax on those goods, what we will see is not only a reduction in the bad parts of the diet that are contributed by those goods, but we will also see a reduction in the good parts of the diet, the nutritionally good parts of the diet. And in particular, what we see with the policy that I've just been describing to you, because it has a major impact on the consumption of dairy products, is a reduction in the consumption of vitamin D and calcium as a reduction of this policy. And then finally, the final unintended consequence is the unintended consequence for producers. There are likely to be land use and farming consequences of this policy. Not all land is suitable for the production of the type of goods that we're encouraging people to consume. Nor are all farmers capable or skilled enough or skilled in the methods that are needed to produce these products. And in a very crude way, what we've done again in a UK context is to simulate the impacts of everybody in the UK switching entirely to the dietary recommendations that are recommended in the UK. An unrealistic scenario, but what we show with that scenario is that almost all upland agriculture disappears in the UK if that takes place. And that is likely to be a consequence. Those types of consequences are likely to be observed everywhere that such a policy takes place. I can't remember how many whammies we're up to now, but I think you get the picture about the policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you.